coffee break is an amazing opportunity for us all to get together and be discussing these really important issues in the Sky Island region. We've been talking about wildlife, and we're really excited now to talk about something that is vital to humans and plants and wildlife in the Sky Island region, and that's water. I think especially at this time of year in the peak of the dry summer, we're hoping that dry summer is going to end soon, right? Everybody do a rain dance. But the water sources throughout Arizona are so incredibly important to us. And we're going to be talking about why we love them, what is a spring, and what are some of the major conservation challenges that springs face in our region, and what are the actions that we all can take collectively to help protect springs. So I'm really excited today to be sharing this discussion with all of you, and I'm gonna pass it off to my colleague, Sami Hammer. She's our springs specialist and has been with the organization for 5 years. Sami is a wealth of knowledge about springs, the snails, the plants, everything about springs. Many of you, I hope, have had the opportunity to go to the field with her on spring surveys. We're gonna be talking a lot about the important work that Sami's been doing for a number of years with many of you with the volunteer help. So thank you in advance for all you've done to help get our Springs program to where it is today. And we're really excited to share the new direction that we're going with this program. So with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Sami, and she will turn it back to me about halfway through our presentation.
Thanks, Emily. There we go, I'll share my screen. Make it big. Yeah. All right. Okay, well, welcome to talking about springs. So just an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to first go over why we love springs, what they look like in the region, what are springs, and then we'll talk about some threats to springs. And then finally, how we and you guys can help take action for springs. So this, and just as I go, I'll tell you a little bit about each spring that's on these slides. So this is a spring that doesn't have a name on the map, so we call it Amazing Spring, and it's in Deer Creek in Aravaipa Canyon, and it's just a really incredible spot. So first off, what is a spring? So springs it's actually pretty simple. They're just places where groundwater is exposed. So it's water from the water table or the aquifer, or an aquifer. And I like to think of it as just where the water table intersects the ground surface. So you can see here on this spring here in the Galliura Mountains called Corral Spring, there's a big cliff in this drainage, and there's water just seeping out of these cracks in the rock all over the place. So where are springs in our Sky Island region? So they're not very well mapped on the Mexico side, at least as far as we've found so far. So this is a map just of the Arizona portion. And you can see Tucson over here on the left, where there's all this grid of city streets, and then I-10 coming across the middle. And then the colors on here just indicate different land ownership. So the green is the more Forest Service lands, and the mountains typically. So you can see all the blue dots are springs. So they're mostly concentrated in our mountains, but they're also in some of the major river valleys. Like you can see, especially here along the San Pedro River, there's a number of springs. And then over here along the Gila River, there are also a lot of springs. So we have about 4,000 or so known in the US portion of the Sky Islands, kind of depending on how exactly you define them. But we know that there are likely, since 2/3 of the region is actually in Mexico and only about 1/3 of it's in the US, there's probably even more than that in the Mexico part of the Sky Islands. So, maybe as many as like 10,000 springs in our region or something like that. And we often find more springs when we're out surveying, going to look for a particular one. So that's probably a little bit of an underestimate too. So they're like a really important water source for our area. So we like to think of our springs, like we divide them into types by how the setting in which they're coming out of the ground. So the most common spring type in the Sky Islands is what we call a Rio Crean spring. It is a little image diagram of it over here. The bricks, the things that look like bricks are like one type of rock, usually like a more porous rock. And then you'll see a little bit of a, not on this image, but I'll show you on the next one. There's another rock type that shows up on these. And so these are springs that emerge in stream channels. And so if you're walking from upstream to downstream in the stream channel, it'll be dry, and then all of a sudden there's water coming out of the ground, and it'll flow down the stream channel for a little while. So this is one beautiful one that we've been monitoring for a few years in the Pajarita Mountains. Over here on the left is Alamo Spring. And that one has both Chiricahua and lowland leopard frogs in it, as well as lots of other plants and animals. And then over in the upper right is Douglas Canyon Spring in the Galliero Mountains. And this is in the wilderness area. And it's an area where the stream is like boulders and cobbles, and then you hit a section of bedrock and water is coming out of right at that junction. And then down on the lower right is Oak Spring in the Huachuca Mountains, where it's just seeping out of lots of different spots in the bedrock along this section of stream. So the next most, so about 60 to 70% of our springs in this area are probably those stream channel springs. So the next most common spring type we have are hill slope springs. So on this diagram over here on the upper left, the gray rock is a kind of impermeable sort of rock. So in a hill slope spring, you'll have water in a water table moving down through porous layers of rock, and then it hits an impermeable layer and comes out at the top of that layer and runs down the hill slope. So over here on the far left is McGrew Spring in the Whetstone Mountains, and this one's coming out of like the slope of the mountain, and it's been dug out in the past by humans, so it's actually has a pool holding water, but that's created by people. And then there's a good picture of one here in the center. Juniper Spring in the Chiricahua Mountains is along the Crest Trail up at like 9,000 or 10,000 feet, and it's coming out of several places in this hillside here. And you can see where humans have come in and put a couple concrete boxes so they could capture and use that water. But there's still water seeping out of the box and several other spots around. And then over here we have Kinglet Spring in the Catalina Mountains. It's nice and lush because it doesn't get much visitation because it's off trail. So another relatively common type of spring in the Sky Islands are Helicrene Springs, and those are also what we call like cienagas most commonly here, or wet meadows, and sometimes in like more northern climates they're called fens. So this is where they occur in flatter areas, and where you have like maybe a crack or a joint in the rock, bringing water up, and it comes out and it flows over an impermeable layer of rock, so it kind of makes a big marshy area. So two really good examples of this are Hospital Flat up in the Pinaleno Mountains. You might know that area but not even realize it's a spring, but there's actually a couple different emergence points in that meadow, and it always has a little bit of water. And then La Sabadilla Cienega is over in a neighborhood on the east side of Tucson, and it's a much lower elevation spring. So really different like water chemistry and plants because it's in such a different place, but similar kind of emergence. And then there's also Baldy Spring up in the Santa Ritas up near Baldy Saddle that you might have hiked by. That's also the same type of spring. And St. David Cienega is like another very nice and special Helicrene spring in the San Pedro Valley. And then the fourth type of spring that we see relatively commonly in our region is a hanging garden. So you can think of this almost like a very steep hill slope spring, where you have a cliff intersecting like maybe a flatter water table, and the water drips out along the cliff and creates this vegetation, grows right off the cliff walls and makes a really pretty hanging garden. So here's a nice example of a little one in a Black Canyon, which is a tributary to Aravaipa Canyon up on the upper left. And then, oops, this one is Middle Sycamore Spring. I messed up the label, it looks like. It's a little, much smaller seep in a cliff in the Galliero Wilderness, but it's had a little box at some point that people tried to put there to capture a little bit of the water. And then Lower Sycamore Spring is downstream of that, much bigger, like it has several big cliffs, and we couldn't even actually get up to the uppermost sources, but it just has water seeping out all over the place and plants growing on the walls. That's really neat spot. And we found spring snails here, which I'll talk about later on too. And then just a couple other spring types we see here that are more rare. One is what we call a limnocrine spring, and it's basically there's water coming out in a pool. So this is Lookout Spring in the Huachuca Mountains. And then another really neat type is called a mound form spring, and that's where you have water with lots of calcium carbonate or other minerals dissolved in it, and it comes out and makes and just like in a cave, when the water evaporates, it leaves these calcium carbonate deposits behind that form this kind of rock called travertine. And this one's really neat. It comes out over here in the lower left. This is where it's coming out of the ground. It's kind of bubbling up in this little hole, and then it runs down this picture on the upper left, and it runs down a cliff of maidenhair fern. It's just dripping lovely through there, and then there's this beautiful blue pool of water where we found a mud turtle, which is a spring endemic. And the photo on the lower right is just some of this calcium carbonate deposit it leaves behind. And this was just, there are so many mounds of calcium carbonate here. You could tell the spring has just been flowing for probably thousands of years. So it was really neat. And then another really neat type that we see very occasionally is a cave spring. So this is where it's coming out in a cave. So this is Holdout Spring in the Galliero Mountains, and you can tell people have hung out here some and developed it a little bit, but you go back into this cave and there's water seeping out of a crack in the bedrock and running down the rock face a little, and then people built a little basin to hold some of the water in. So now that you've seen some of our springs, like what makes springs so special and like why are they important? Well, the most obvious, of course, is that they have water. So this map over here on the right is a map of the Arizona part of the Sky Islands, and all these little blue lines are our perennial streams that run year round. So there's a few of them and they're scattered around, but there's large areas of the Sky Islands with no perennial streams. But when you overlay the springs on top of that, that's all these white dots. You can see that it really fills in the area and just makes water available much more widely across the landscape. So because all that water's out there, it's really important to plants and wildlife. So lots of animals don't live just at springs, but roam across the landscape. For example, deer or bighorn sheep still need to come and drink water every day or even every few days. So springs are their main water sources. And then springs also create habitat for riparian plants and animals that can only live where there is pretty reliable water. And then there's even a few species that live only at springs. So I'll give you a little tour of some of all those animals now. So this is a spring that's down just within our border wildlife study area, and we've had a camera at this spring for I think a year or so. And it comes out in a stream just up above to the right of this photo and flows down through several bedrock pools before disappearing into some gravel. This is a coati walking over for a drink of water in the morning. And then here we have a mountain lion making the same little journey in the evening. And then deer, of course, need to come drink water at springs too. So we see those really commonly. And then we have skunks, which this is, I think, a hooded skunk. We have 4 different species in the area, which you guys might have heard about. So this is one of them visiting that spring. And here's a bear coming over to get a drink of water. And bears especially seem to really love springs. I'll show you some more photos later. And then just a few more photos from that same spring. There's a ringtail cat right here. There's a small relative of the raccoon and coati. There's a roadrunner and a coyote and some more deer and even a little squirrel over here. So, and these are a few more photos of just animals that we've seen at spring surveys that we've done. So Springs are really important to birds, especially for migratory birds, but really all birds need to come drink water at springs and forage insects from the plants growing around springs. There are snakes that we find near springs, especially garter snakes, because the water is important for them. And then this lower picture is a bear in a trough at a spring. So this is something we see a lot. Bears love to come take a bath in the puddle or the pond or the trough of the spring. So, especially in the middle of the summer. And springs, of course, are not only important to like vertebrates, but also invertebrates. So we see lots of butterflies and moths and other invertebrates. There's species that have to come there to lay their eggs, like dragonflies, and fly around. And some species, of course, that live only in the water in the spring. So, and in addition to all those animals, there's, of course, all the plants. So these are a few of the ones that we see at springs pretty often. This scarlet monkey flower on the left is a pretty neat one because it tends to only show up if there's year-round water at the spring. So that's a good indicator that the spring is there and has water all the time for animals. And alder is a tree that we see sometimes too, and it's likewise indicates that there's water there most of the time. We have our own Arizona walnut species that we often see at springs, and it's kind of neat when you're looking for a spring. You know, you might be in an area of pine trees or oaks, and then you see a walnut, and you know that that's where you're headed for. So it's good to help find springs too. Then we have canyon grapes that like to grow near water. Deer grass is kind of neat because it's sometimes the first indicator that we see that there's some moisture there. So it doesn't indicate that the spring is reliable year round, but it shows that there's probably water there at some point in the year. And we usually only see those around springs and some of our creeks. And then there's this maidenhair fern, which is this beautiful little fern that likes to grow in hanging gardens. And then we have some of our endemic species, the turtle, mud turtle I talked about earlier. Then one of the neatest ones is these tiny little spring snails up here in the upper right. They're so small, they're like almost like the size of a grain of sand or a little bit bigger, and they only live at springs, and usually within maybe the first 1 to 3 yards of where the water's coming out of the ground. And they're native to this area, and even each mountain range will often have a different species of spring snail. And then there's plants like this pharyngium over here that only grows at a handful of cienega type springs in our region. So it just lives in the Sky Island region. It just lives at a certain type of spring, and it's really rare. So it's really neat to see those, and they wouldn't exist without springs. So because springs provide all that for wildlife and plants, you can see species stacking, which you can go to a spring and you can see the spring endemics, the riparian plants and animals, and then if you're monitoring it, you also see a lot of the wildlife in the region. So you can go to one spot to get a really good picture of all the plants and animals that occur in an area. And springs might be climate refugia as our climate changes because they're cooler and wetter. But I'll let Emily tell you more about that in a little bit. And also we just love springs because there's water, and humans love cooling off in the desert. So I mean, I've been to probably over 100 springs now, and they're still exciting to me every time I come across a new one or the same one that I've been to before. So what are some of the primary threats and human impacts to springs? One of the main ones we see is flow regulation. So you've seen in some of these pictures, there's troughs and different structures at springs. So about half the springs we've been to, or maybe a little bit more, have been developed at some point for use by humans. This is where people build some kind of concrete or rock structure around the source of the spring to capture the water. And sometimes a portion or all of the water is actually piped away from where the spring originally was. So when this happens, you lose spring habitat, you lose the amount of water you have available for wildlife and plants. So it's not inherently terrible, but it's definitely a big impact to springs and can really negatively impact them. So this is Peña Blanca Spring near Peña Blanca Lake in the Pajarita Mountains. You can see it's boxed. And then this other spring in the middle is Observatory Spring in the Catalina Mountains. And you can see there's a little dam that was created with a pipe to catch the water in this, where it came out in the stream, and then it used to be piped away. And one thing we often see is that these developments aren't in use anymore. So that's, they're just kind of sitting there dripping water. And then over here we have Hidden Spring in the Rincon Mountains, where humans actually built a well right by the spring site, and they have a electric line running up here that powers a pump that pipes water out into a trough nearby that cattle still use. Another big impact we see is to surface water quality, where surface water quality decreases, and that's usually either from mining or from livestock. So with livestock, they come and they camp around the area, they hang out around the area sometimes and poop a lot right in the water, and that can decrease the water quality, increase the water temperature by like taking away vegetation around the area. And then this one is a good example of mining. It's Happy Jack Spring in the Santa Rita Mountains, and there's several mines above this. And you can see how the water colors change. There's actually some white precipitate in the water from something, we're not totally sure what it is. And then there's also the pH of this was below 5, which is really low, and probably like it's basically caused by acid mine drainage. Another big impact we see are road and trail impacts. So since springs are so important to humans, we often like have trails that go right to them or even right through them, and that can cause trampling and decrease the quality of the habitat. This is a kind of extreme example here. Wren Spring in the Catalina Mountains is right in Summerhaven, actually just above the cookie cabin. And it comes out just above this road, but then, and also at the edge of the road, but then the road, there's a road graded right, as you can see, bottom right hand corner, graded right through the middle of like what would normally be the spring habitat. So. And as I've hinted at numerous times, herbivory and grazing is another really big impact to spring. So here's like a good example of how bad it can be. Bear Spring in the Whetstone Mountains, just this whole area is denuded of vegetation. There's like hummocks of mud. The water's all mucky and gross. And cattle and wild horses can, not so much in our region, but can decrease, like they can spend so much time drinking water that there's not as much time for wildlife to come in and drink water at the same time. And then you can see here at Yawkey Spring and the Huachucas that they'll often like just eat the vegetation down really low and decrease the amount of water available for everybody else. And so those are like some of the local impacts of springs, and now I'll hand it off to Emily to tell you more.
Great. Thanks, Sami.
Thank you.
All right. Well, many of the things that Sami described are really the most apparent things that we see when we go and we visit springs. And I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the location of springs relative to our sky island landscape. And in the map that you can see here, you can see that the points of springs are in blue and they are within watershed boundaries. And I like to think of watersheds as a bowl. And it's a bowl where water can come in from the top or anywhere within the surface of the bowl, and it's draining down. But we really need our watersheds to function like bowls made out of sponges. That's what we want to see happen. We want to see the mountains be able to absorb the precipitation either as snow or rain that comes into the system, absorb it so that it can drip down back and infiltrate into the aquifers, and also so that it can slowly be released over time. And when our aquifers are full, then they are pumping water, they're feeding water into those springs. And so every time we think about the condition and health of springs, we have to remember it's tied to this much larger water or hydrologic system. So this is a simple schematic, well, simple being a relative term, but this is from a relatively simple part of the Colorado Plateau, which is a schematic that demonstrates where water droplets are actually going when they move through elevation and land on different parts of the mountain. And so where you're seeing these blue dots, imagine those are springs. And when snowpack comes in at the top and it melts, slowly it's infiltrating down. Some of it is running off down to the lowland valley areas, but some is getting in to the actual mountain geologic structures themselves. And so you can track the the path that water might be taking. And depending on where the journey that these water droplets take as they are moving through the mountains means when the water comes out, it might be a different temperature. It may have more chemically rich ions in it, depending on where it's coming out. The longer that the water is below ground, it warms up. And so there are some interesting things you can do by measuring the chemical composition of spring water and even the temperature to understand how old that water is when it's coming out through springs. So here's one of the scenarios that we worry about when we think about how springs are going to be affected by the larger watershed that they're sitting in. So here's an example from the Chiricahua Mountains after the Horseshoe Fire that burned vast area of this Sky Island region. When the forest burned, there was a massive erosion event that happened, and you can see this major landslide. Now, we get concerned about this because it is doing multiple things. Certainly, if there's a spring close to this erosion site, it could be completely blanketed by the sediment that's been traveling down slope. And if you cover and completely silt over a spring, the water may not ever come back to the surface again. So that not only removes the ability for the water to be available to plants and animals at the surface, but it could be completely eliminating habitat for those amazing species that Sami was talking about. So that's a really acute problem that we get concerned about. But there are other things that fires can do as well. Fires can make the soil slump off as part of this erosion. It also is just removing vegetation. And it's making, right after a fire, often soils can become hydrophobic or resist absorbing water. So those are things that are concerning because it actually is affecting how that water system is going to be feeding springs for the long term. Remember, we want these systems to work like sponges. We need them to absorb that water if we want water to continually flow through our springs. So when fires happen, that is a concern. Of course, fires are a very normal part of the Sky Island ecosystem, but what's changing right now is the intensity and the frequency at which fires are actually happening because of increasing aridity, changes in precipitation patterns, and a history of land management where putting fires out is often the first response. It means we have forest systems up in our Sky Island region that may burn much hotter and less frequently than they did in the past, creating this cycle that really affects how water actually gets in and recharges our aquifers. Here are a couple examples of springs that have been burned by fires in recent years. On the left-hand side, where you see the stone ring around this spring, this is Anita Spring in the Chiricahua Mountains. This was one that burned through, it was burned over, and a lot of the vegetation was removed and burned away, but it hasn't been silted in. You can still find the spring, and over time, that vegetation is gonna come back. So it's very common in low intensity fires or even moderate ones to find only minor impacts to springs like this. And on the right-hand side, this is Flicker Spring from the Catalina Mountains. And this was burned with a very low intensity fire. And there were almost no measurable impacts to the actual spring or the habitat it creates following fire. So that's really the good news. And I know for many of you that have been in Tucson or around Tucson over the last month, we've all been watching the Catalina Mountains burn as the Bighorn Fire has swept from the west to the east side. And daily at Sky Island Alliance, we've been talking about which springs might be affected by the Bighorn Fire. And that's one of the first things we want to do when it's safe to re-enter the Catalina Mountains again, is to go back and check the condition of these springs. From the Aspen Fire in the past, we know that even 12 years after that fire, it was difficult to find all of the springs. One spring in particular, Box Spring, was never located again after the fire, but there were many springs that were found. And it, like the Flicker Spring here, it really shows that not all springs are going to be decimated by a major fire event. We love this picture. This is High Peak Cienega in the Pinaleño Mountains. And here, this shows how springs actually served as a refuge and during a major fire. So you can see on the hill slope behind the Cienega, that many of the conifers were killed, completely obliterated in the fire. But actually in the spring area itself and the footprint of the habitat that that was contained around the spring, conifers survived, many other plants survived, and it's because of how much moisture was in the soil and the conditions of the cienega itself. So springs really can be a bright spot in the immediate aftermath of a fire and can help many species find water and food resources as the larger system is recovering from fire. So springs are super important in fire recovery. So this concept of springs as refugia is something that Sami talked about earlier. And can springs be that sort of refuge, that shelter, that safe space, the continued place for many species to find the resources they need to survive as climate changes? And there's a new paper that came out this year that we have on our website if you're interested in reading it. Both Louise, our executive director, and Sami were co-authors on it, so I can very proudly, as their colleague, share some conceptual models that they published in this paper. The idea as climate is changing is that spring discharge, so how much water is actually coming out of the spring source and flowing into the spring habitat, is dependent on so many of the factors we just talked about. And over time, spring discharge or the flow rate, it could go up if all of a sudden we get a lot more water and we take care of our aquifers. Maybe it will. But I think many of us are very concerned that because of increasing human demand for water and pumping water out of our aquifers, there's the potential that combined with aridity and decreasing precipitation, that we might actually see a decrease in the amount of water that's flowing out of springs. Now, what these three different graphs are showing is the rate at which that flow might drop and what that means for the species that are dependent on the spring habitat. So the top scenario A, a stable refugium, that's what we want to see. That's what we want to see. We want to see, even if the flow does drop a little bit, that it stays at a high enough threshold that water remains available for spring dependent species. I think we can all imagine that fish, many amphibians, they need large pools of water to be able to survive and to breed. And so it's going to require the most amount of water to protect those species. Like the spring snails that Sami was talking about, some of the endemic spring plants and other wildlife animals that are roaming through the region and need to be able to drink, they need some sort of surface water available. But there are scenarios where if the water flow drops enough, we might begin to see a shrinking in the water pool that's available at different springs and a shrinking of the available habitat created by that spring. So in a drier future, in scenario B, there could be a refuge for these species for a period of time, but if the flow drops enough, all of a sudden we see a shrinking of the actual available surface water. And that's of concern. In the interim, we might be okay, but we could be looking at a future where the habitat quality dramatically decreases. And then the worst case scenario is at the bottom, close your eyes, don't look at it, where we really see a rapid tail off and this water source shrinks away. And you see not just stranding of the species over a short period of time, but complete loss of spring dependent species. So what I like about this is it's helping us understand that the choices that we make at a policy level, at a local level with how we manage our watersheds, and then at the particular springs themselves, we can help influence which one of these scenarios we move into. And clearly, the top scenario, having these stable refuges for spring-dependent species over time, is what we want to see. So let's talk about how to do that, because this is the good stuff. This is what all of us can do to help make sure that springs are going to be vibrant and available for us and all of the biodiversity that we care about in the future. So here's a concept of how we can think about the conservation process for springs in a general sense. And we're going to walk through some different examples of how we do each part of this work. And I've put it in the box of policy because I can't emphasize enough how critically important it is that we're thinking about the land management practices, the legal framework for how we govern the protection for water sources. We had a major setback earlier this year where changes to the Clean Water Act that had been put in place in 1972 stripped away protections for a majority of water sources here in Arizona. Now ephemeral and intermittent water sources don't have the same sort of protection they did last year, which for a place like Arizona, with the map that Sami showed with how few perennial water sources we have, it means that many water sources like springs are going to be without protection. So this is an opportunity for us to really think about how we can be seeking policy changes to holistically be protecting water sources like springs. But if we delve, and I'm going to focus below the policy level on the landscape itself, what are the actions we can take? As a conservation organization based in science, one of the first things that we do is we collect as much data as we can across the landscape about the distribution across the landscape of springs, their condition. And so there are many data sets that are available that can help us understand where water sources are, like springs, or predict where they may be. But one of the most important things to do once you have that information is then to actually go and survey the springs, ground truth it, go and look at the actual condition of the spring when you go there. And then that gets into hopefully a stewardship and monitoring cycle where we combine the scientific information with the values of what we want to see as that outcome in the future for a spring. And we make decisions about how to deal with a box that might be creating pools of water, but not available to all the species we care about. What modifications might we want to take? Thinking about whether there are too many invasive species that are pushing out native plants. So I'm going to talk through a couple examples about how we do the stewardship and how we can monitor to see whether the actions we take are actually effective. So here is a fun project that Sami and I had the pleasure of joining midway through the project last year. We did a spring prioritization, and this was only for US springs. We're really looking forward to it in the months and years ahead to greatly expand this project to incorporate Sonoran springs as well. We used spatial data that we had for the Sky Island region on springs from the border north, even all the way up this finger out going up northeast of Phoenix. And we took all the available information we had about these springs. Many of them hadn't been surveyed. So this is based on data that we could glean from a variety of spatial resources. And we decided it would be helpful for us to compare what we know about these springs and determine which ones are the most threatened. So the threat score that we created is shown here, where darker red dots are springs that are facing more acute threats. Threat from fire risk, proximity to roads, and there are a bunch of factors that went into this. So Sami can share a link to actually visit this map viewer, and you can go in and learn all about what went behind this. So you can visit our website and learn more about it. But I wanted to show you this because this is how many springs we think are there on the landscape. And hopefully, like Sami said, this is an underestimate. But here's just the subset of springs that so far we've been able to visit, just Sky Island Alliance with our volunteers. There are many other partners that are collecting data on springs. And what we're hoping to do starting this summer, but for the years going forward, is to have many more pairs of eyes collecting data on the ground at these spring sources so that we have an early warning system about when these threats are tipping over and requiring action. And so we can mobilize and work collaboratively with land managers to help improve the fate and the condition for springs at these sites. And I'm going to talk about how we can do that at the end of the talk. So all of the data that comes in and comparing springs, looking at the relative conservation values or their threats, gives us information about where to invest our stewardship effort. Now, we would love to say we could go and put our arms around every spring and help improve its condition. And I hope over the long haul we're going to be able to do that. But the data and the survey data helps us make sure that we go and help the springs that need our help the most first. And so we use the data and the spring prioritization tool to inform where we're going to go and do spring stewardship projects. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of what stewardship actually means as it relates to springs. And, I like to say, if only there was a handbook on how to do that, but luckily there is. The Arizona Restoration Handbook for Springs was developed a few years ago, and it is a great overview. It's on our website if you're interested in reading more in-depth information on the background of springs and giving tips on how we can actually go and enhance habitat quality, protect water quality at our spring sites. So on the map on the right-hand side, this gives you a sense of where we've been working along that spring conservation pipeline, if you will, over time. Blue springs are ones that we visited, actually have had surveys. If it's a red dot, that means it's been monitored multiple times. It's had repeat visits, and we're starting to track trends in the condition of the spring over time. If it's green, that means it's a place where we've actually taken a stewardship action there, and I'm going to highlight a couple of those. And then the purple outlines are watersheds where we've been thinking more holistically with our partners about how to improve watershed health, which we know is so important to ultimately be able to sustain springs. Okay, the stars are the two places that I'm going to highlight now with our stewardship work. The first one being over here in the Chiricahua Mountains. And then we're going to tour just south of the border, the southern end of the Huachuca Mountains, and look at some spring work that's happening right now at Rancho Los Fresnos. Okay, here are the beautiful Chiricahua Mountains, home to many, many important springs. Here's an example of a really simple action that can be taken to make sure that a spring water source is safely available to animals. So if it has been modified and into a trough like this, a spring still can have a lot of value for animals that need to get a drink of water. You can even have amphibians going in and reproducing in them, but they need to be able to get safely out. So one of the simple things that we do when we go and look at a spring is there surface water available, and would a small animal be able to safely get in and out? And so this is a nice ramp that was put in place at Hermitage Spring to make sure that animals can safely approach the water. And then I'm going to talk about Ash Spring, because this is a really exciting project that was done in 2014. And this project really combined what was known about the spring in the past with recognizing current threats to the spring habitat. This was a spring that was originally boxed, and it was thought that in the past there were multiple pools, places where water was welling up and there was surface water available. Over time, there were invasive species, the pools had disappeared, and the conservation plan for Ash Spring decided that what needed to happen here were to redevelop some of the pools to have water available again, to deal with some of the invasive species like horehound that had come in, but also to protect the wetland meadow habitat. So the number of pools that were chosen were balancing how much should actually be excavated to create pools and how much of the grassland habitat should be maintained. So here's a picture before any of the work happened. You can see there used to be a fence that had fallen down. Cattle were frequently going in. And like Sami said, that can have a lot of impacts on spring habitat. Oops. Okay, so here flashing forward until the after picture, and yes, it's greener. This is partially taken at a different time of year, but new fencing had gone in. You can see a little bit of the pool that was dug and new native plants. Before any of the pools were created, there was a salvage effort to make sure that important native plants were rescued out of the site where the backhoe was coming in. And they were replanted out, and there were additional native plants that were propagated to be installed after the pools were created. So here's the really exciting stuff. I always think that restoration work, it's like watching surgery being done. It's always like, what's happening? So here's an example of big coming and scooping out to create the contours, places where water could flow and collect and form that pool habitat. That's really important for animals to be able to drink from exposed surface water and to create the in-water habitat for many species. On the right-hand side, you can see the original vision with multiple pools coming down from a box at the top. But ultimately, three felt like the right number when the pools were created. So here is a beautiful picture of this area, and then after this, the pond was actually created. So here you can see two of the ponds in the view, and then the new fencing that went along the side. Wildlife-friendly fencing can be so important to make sure that large wildlife animals, large mammals, are able to safely come into an area, but it helps make sure that the cattle stay on the other side so they're not directly trampling the new habitat that's being created. And another picture, this is 4 months later after the pools were created. What I was told, it was 4 months later and a whole lot of rain later. So there, a lot of water came into the system, and it's really great to see this amazing habitat. I can only imagine how quickly the animals gravitated to these new ponds. Fortunately, Sky Island Alliance did monitoring to look at the wildlife and how it returned, when and how many animal species came to Ash Spring. And it was really exciting. Here are a few images of the animals that were found in September of that same year. So just 3 months after the pools were created, 16 different species of bats were detected, including this cute pallid bat. Look at those ears. And Chiricahua leopard frog tadpoles were also seen in. So this is sort of, if we build it, they will come. Wildlife species find water so quickly when it's out on the landscape, and this just shows how meaningful it can be to do these sort of spring enhancement projects to benefit biodiversity. Okay, and for my last example, I'm just going to show a project that's going on right now in partnership with Naturalia. This is a conservation group that's managing the Los Fresnos Reserve in Sonora, and they have been putting out wildlife-friendly fencing around several of the springs at Los Fresnos. And here they are with the Huachuca Mountains in the distance. Here's the field crew from Naturalia unspooling the wire, getting ready to protect the Agua Dulce spring and make sure that the cattle that are grazing aren't getting into that habitat. So a really simple action that can have a really big impact on water quality, the diversity of plants that are living right in the riparian spring area. And as Sami said, cows can frighten away other animals. So keeping them further away can help make it more accessible, the water source more accessible to wildlife. Okay, so we've talked about this continuum. The data that comes in really helps us know what sort of stewardship actions are needed. Do we have a cattle problem? Do we need to be putting in fences? Can help us design our stewardship activities, and then we can continue to watch these springs that we're nurturing over time and to see how they are doing through monitoring and change our actions, practice adaptive management as needed. But we really are still in the phase where we need so much more information and more surveys on the ground to understand which springs need our help the most. Our volunteers for the entire life of the Springs program at Sky Island Alliance have been totally vital to making this happen. Sami and others have been leading expeditions out into the wilderness to document and survey springs. We're going to be continuing that work in a socially distant way going forward. And so we're really excited to share with you that whether you've been a spring volunteer in the past or not, we've got an opportunity for you to help us now. We've developed a new Spring Seeker program, and it's a smartphone application, a simple survey form that if you're out hiking or trail running, I see you, Catlo, we're going to be able to get data from you if you're willing to stop. It can only, sometimes it's just 5 minutes of your time to log in some information about where you are, take some photos of the spring or water source. It's available in both English and Spanish. You don't need any special equipment. And we're really excited to be able to get the Spring Seeker into your hands so that you can help us crowdsource the condition of springs over a much wider landscape and to help us keep eyes on these springs more frequently over time. So here's just a preview of what it looks like when it's on your phone. We've developed a Spring Seeker user guide. And if you're really interested in learning how to get involved with this project and how to navigate the survey on your phone and get tips about which springs we would love you to visit next, we invite you to tune in for a special coffee break we're going to be doing next Thursday. same time, Thursday, 9:30. And it's going to be an overview of how to do the Spring Seeker project on your own. So we're really excited to share that with you. We'll be sending out an email today with the link, and we'll be putting it in the chat here if you want to just go ahead and sign up for that. And for those of you that get really into this and want to work with us, we do have funding to do more wilderness springs this summer. And so we're going to be working with all of you to come up with ways to do it in a physical, social distancing framework. And so Sami will have more information about wilderness spring survey plans later this summer. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in and talking about springs. You're going to be hearing a lot more from us about Spring Seeker and opportunities to engage with springs in the Sky Island and work with us as volunteers, even as the COVID pandemic continues, unfortunately. But we're excited to be able to have found a creative way to continue this really critical work this summer. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're really happy to answer questions that have come up.